Late August 1944. For the officers of the German High Command, the war in France should be a solved equation. On their maps, General George S. Patton's Third Army is a fragile blue line stretched hundreds of miles from the Normandy coast. According to every German calculation, every estimate of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and road capacity, his armored columns should have ground to a halt days ago. And yet, frantic reports from the front insist Patton is still advancing. The question in Berlin isn't if he will stop, it's how is he still moving at all? The answer to the Germans' bewildered question was not a secret weapon, but something far more mundane and far more ambitious. An immense, rolling conveyor belt of trucks running day and night. Officially, it was codenamed the Red Ball Express. This was a desperate, improvised solution to a logistical catastrophe that threatened to stop the Allied armies in their tracks. The plan was to turn a network of shattered French roads into a one-way, non-stop artery of supply, a feat of organization on a scale the world had never witnessed. But this operation, born of crisis, would push men and machines to their absolute limits. The question is not just if it could sustain the advance, but how, and at what brutal, unsustainable cost. To understand this crisis, you have to understand the plan. The Allied invasion of Europe was never meant to be a lightning war. Planners in London had prepared for a slow, brutal, methodical grind through the dense hedgerows of Normandy. A battle of attrition they were equipped to win. But in late July 1944, Operation Cobra shattered the German lines. Suddenly, the hedgerow war was over. General Patton's Third Army, unleashed from the constipated beachhead, began a spectacular advance across France. Paris was liberated. The German Seventh Army was in a headlong retreat. It was a stunning, war-winning victory, and it was about to become a logistical catastrophe. By the end of August, the front line was no longer 20 miles from the beaches. It was 400 miles away. 400 miles of narrow, shell-pocked roads winding through liberated but devastated towns. Every single gallon of gasoline, every bullet, every food ration had to travel that entire distance. The Allied armies were advancing so fast they were literally outrunning their own supplies. The spearhead of the invasion was in danger of being cut off, not by German panzers, but by its own momentum. The core of the problem lay back at the coast. The Allied plan had depended on capturing a major deep-water port. They got one, Cherbourg, but the German defenders had turned its destruction into a dark art. They didn't just blow up the docks, they executed a textbook demolition. Cranes were toppled into the water, the harbor was sown with thousands of mines, some on timers set to go off weeks later, and massive block ships were sunk to clog the channels. Engineers estimated it would take at least 3 months to clear a single channel. The ingenious temporary Mulberry harbors were still operational, but they were designed for the initial buildup, not to sustain millions of men in a high-speed pursuit across an entire country. There was a backup plan, of course. The ultimate logistical solution was supposed to be the French national railway system. It was dense, efficient, and capable of moving the immense tonnage the armies required. There was just one problem. For the past year, Allied bombers and French resistance fighters had conducted a brilliant, systematic campaign to destroy that very railway system. They had bombed marshalling yards, blown up bridges, and sabotaged locomotives. The goal was to prevent the Germans from reinforcing their troops in Normandy. The strategy had worked perfectly. It had isolated the battlefield and guaranteed the success of the D-Day landings. And now, the Allies found themselves staring at the ruin they had created, a paralyzed network that was completely useless to them. The German High Command was right. By every conventional military metric, the Allied offensive was on the verge of collapse. Starved of fuel and ammunition, the advance would have to stop. But the war wasn't being run by conventional metrics anymore. With the ports crippled and the railways shattered, Allied commanders faced a stark choice. Find a radical new way to supply the front, or watch the greatest victory of the war wither and die in the heart of France. The crisis came to a head on August 21, 1944. In a makeshift headquarters near Valognes, a group of senior Allied logistics officers convened an emergency meeting. The man at the center was Colonel Lauren "Red" Ayers, a career transportation officer. The problem on the table was no longer theoretical. The supply situation was officially declared critical. Patton's tanks were literally running on fumes, some divisions receiving only a few hours of fuel per day. With the railways gone and the ports clogged, the solution had to come from the road. But the existing chaos of two-way military and civilian traffic was a bottleneck. The proposal put forward was breathtaking in its simplicity and audacity. They would commandeer a huge portion of the French road network. A vast, continuous loop of highways would be designated for military supply only. One set of roads for northbound traffic, delivering supplies to the front. A parallel set for southbound empty trucks, returning for another load. All civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would enforce a strict 24-hour one-way flow. The operation was given a code name borrowed from railroad slang for priority freight, the Red Ball Express. The order was signed. The system had to be running by August 25th. They had less than 100 hours to invent and implement the largest, most disciplined trucking operation in history. The plan was now authorized, but a plan on paper is one thing. To make it work, they would need an army of drivers and mechanics, thousands of them, ready to push their vehicles and themselves far beyond any known limit. On August 25, 1944, the plan became reality. Before dawn, the first engines turned over. The workhorse of this new express line was the General Motors CCKW, a rugged 2.5-ton truck known to every soldier simply as the Jimmy. It was reliable, powerful, and ubiquitous. For the Red Ball's inaugural run, over 5,900 of them were marshaled into convoys. But the heart of the operation wasn't the steel, it was the men behind the wheel. And here lies a critical, often overlooked fact of the campaign. Nearly 75% of the drivers assigned to the Red Ball Express were African American soldiers. Pulled from segregated quartermaster and transportation corps units, they were men who had often been relegated to manual labor, far from the front. Now, almost overnight, they were handed the keys to the Allied advance. For thousands of them, this was the first and only chance to play a direct, decisive role in the war. The fate of Patton's army now rested squarely on their shoulders. The system they drove into was a marvel of traffic engineering, imposed on the chaos of war. Army engineers had raced ahead of the first convoys, tacking up simple circular signs, each painted with a red dot marking the exclusive one-way routes. At every major crossroads and village square, military police stood on platforms, waving flags and whistles, their sole job to keep the Red Ball trucks moving. They were human traffic signals, holding back all other military and civilian vehicles, creating a protected channel for the convoys. The rules were strict and clear. A mandatory speed limit of 25 miles per hour, a required interval of 60 yards between each truck to prevent chain reaction collisions. But these rules were written in a headquarters, not in the cab of a speeding truck at 2 a.m. The real pressure came from the dispatchers, who cared about one thing: tonnage delivered. And so, drivers routinely pushed their Jimmies to 40, 50, even 60 miles per hour, racing down narrow roads, often in total blackout conditions, their headlights reduced to tiny cat's eye slits. The 60-yard interval shrank to a few truck lengths. It was a calculated risk, a violation of orders that was unofficially encouraged in the desperate race to the front. From the other side of the front line, German intelligence officers were painting a very different picture for their commanders. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, and later Walter Model, received daily reports that confirmed their own logistical assumptions. Allied prisoners of war spoke of fuel rationing. Aerial reconnaissance showed thin columns of trucks, stretched out and vulnerable. To the German staff, schooled in the harsh realities of the Eastern Front, where entire armies had been lost to severed supply lines, the Allied situation looked not just precarious, but fatal. They saw the 400-mile-long supply route as Patton's Achilles heel. Their strategic response was to fall back, to trade space for time, and to wait for the inevitable. They were confident the American offensive would simply run out of gas, just as their own panzers so often had in Russia. They failed to comprehend the sheer industrial scale of the American solution. The idea that an entire road network could be turned into a factory conveyor belt was outside their military doctrine. They were waiting for a flood to stop, unable to see the Americans were building a dam. But the price of this brute force solution was paid by the individual driver. The Red Ball Express did not stop for night, or for weather, or for weekends. It ran continuously. A driver would deliver his load, grab a few hours of sleep on a cot while his truck was serviced, and immediately be sent back to the coast for another run. Shifts of 36 to 48 hours behind the wheel became common. Exhaustion was the enemy. To combat it, drivers sang, talked to themselves, and, according to the accounts of many veterans, were issued amphetamines by medics to stay awake. The danger was constant. Drivers would fall asleep at the wheel, their trucks veering off the road or into an oncoming convoy on the return loop. In the dark, a disabled truck without lights was a death trap. And while the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, lone German fighters would still occasionally strafe the bumper-to-bumper columns, a terrifying lottery for the men in the unarmored cabs. The sides of the Red Ball route became a graveyard of twisted steel, overturned jimmies, burned-out fuel tankers, and wrecked supply trucks. For every truck on the road, another was in critical condition. Behind the army of drivers was a second, equally vital army of mechanics. Ordnance maintenance crews worked around the clock in makeshift depots, often just clearings by the side of the road. They were tasked with keeping the fleet moving, but the trucks were being driven into the ground. Engines were overheating, transmissions were failing, axles were snapping under the strain of overloading and high speeds on poor roads. When spare parts ran out, and they ran out quickly, the mechanics turned to a practice known as cannibalization. Trucks that were deemed too damaged to be repaired quickly were systematically stripped. Their tires, engines, alternators, and drive shafts were harvested to get other, more viable trucks back on the road. A vehicle might be towed in with a broken axle and leave with the engine from a wreck and the tires from another. The Red Ball Express was consuming itself to stay alive. It was an incredible, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable display of logistical power. The Express was delivering an average of 5,000 tons of supplies per day, with peaks reaching nearly 12,000 tons, a volume the planners had thought impossible. But the armies at the front were advancing so fast that their demand was insatiable. For every 10,000 gallons of fuel delivered, they asked for 20. The system, for all its ferocity, was barely keeping pace. And as the trucks were being worn down and cannibalized, a new, more fundamental crisis was emerging, one that no mechanic, no matter how clever, could fix. But cannibalization was just a symptom. The system's true breaking point, the one thing mechanics couldn't fix, was rubber. The relentless high-speed runs on hot, debris-strewn roads were shredding tires at a catastrophic rate. They were failing far faster than they could be replaced from the United States. A truck without tires is just a 5,000-pound paperweight, and the Red Ball was creating thousands of them. At that very moment, a second front opened, not against the Germans, but between the Allied generals themselves. George Patton and Bernard Montgomery were locked in a bitter struggle for resources. Each was convinced that his army alone could deliver the war-winning blow, and each lobbied Supreme Commander Eisenhower relentlessly, demanding that his front receive the lion's share of the fuel and ammunition flowing down the Red Ball. Their constant competing political maneuvers created chaos for the logisticians. A convoy destined for Patton's tanks could be rerouted north to Montgomery at a moment's notice, turning the supply artery into a battleground of ambition. And yet, despite the equipment failures and the infighting, the drivers kept pushing. By early September, the Red Ball Express was hitting its absolute peak performance, a roaring torrent of steel and gasoline. But the armies at the front, smelling victory, were demanding even more. On September 13th, the Red Ball Express achieved the impossible. In a single 24-hour period, its drivers delivered a record-shattering 12,500 tons of supplies to the front. It was a monumental testament to organization and human endurance, the absolute zenith of the operation. And yet, it was not enough. Hundreds of miles away, on the banks of the Moselle River, the consequences of that shortfall became brutally clear. The spearhead of Patton's Third Army, the 4th Armored Division, was poised to breach the German frontier, but its Sherman tanks were not stopped by enemy fire. They were stopped by an empty fuel gauge. One by one, the engines sputtered and died. The unstoppable advance had literally run out of gas. The German High Command's prediction from late August had finally come true. The American offensive had been halted by its own supply line. The Red Ball Express had defied their calculations and delayed the inevitable for 3 critical weeks, but it could not defy physics. This halt gave the battered German forces the one gift they desperately needed: time. Time to rush reinforcements to the border, time to regroup, time to man the formidable defenses of the West Wall. The great pursuit across France was over. The Red Ball would continue to run until November, its red ball signs a fixture on the roads of France. But its most critical, high-stakes phase had ended at a riverbank, with the silent tanks of a paralyzed army. So was the entire desperate effort a failure? The Red Ball Express did not prevent the Allied supply crisis of autumn 1944. It couldn't, but for 82 critical days, it held back the inevitable, and that postponement was the margin of victory in the race across France. It enabled the liberation of Paris and pushed the front line to the German border months ahead of schedule, a pace that utterly shattered German strategic planning. They had prepared for a halt near Normandy. They got one at their own doorstep. The operation proved, in the starkest possible terms, that a modern, mechanized war was fundamentally a contest of logistics. It showed that victory depended as much on the endurance of a truck driver and the ingenuity of a mechanic as it did on the courage of a frontline soldier. This was not a perfect, heroic legend. It was a logistical triumph born of sheer desperation, achieved at an immense cost in men and machines. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is a testament to industrial might and improvisation, but it is found most powerfully in the men who made it run. The advance was fueled by gasoline, a river of it flowing across France. But the current that truly drove it forward belonged to the men behind the wheel, thousands of soldiers racing to deliver a freedom to Europe that they themselves had not yet been guaranteed at home.